Hi, and good evening, everyone. My name is Daphna Rabinovich, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the sixth in our series of Giller monthly master panels. Tonight, we throw the spotlight on some of Canada's leading LGBTQ2S plus writers and artists as they explore issues around sex and gender, institutionalized harassment, publishers' conscious or unconscious bias, and more. For those of us in Toronto, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I'd like to welcome tonight's host, multidisciplinary artist and writer, Kama La Mackerel. Their work has been exhibited and performed internationally, and their writing in English, French, and Creole has appeared in publications both digital and in print. Kama will introduce our panelists for tonight's event. And please feel free to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you might have. They'll be put to the panel during the last 15 minutes of tonight's event. So I'm as eager as you are to get to it. Please welcome Kama La Mackerel.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Daphna, for this introduction. So I would actually like to invite our panelists to join me as well at this moment as I introduce every single one of you. It is such a pleasure, such a delight that I get to be in conversation with all of you. What a privilege that we get to share this space. So I will quickly, from the heart, introduce each of our panelists. I will start with Arielle Twist, who's based in Halifax. Arielle is a super talented, multi-force, multidisciplinary artist who is completing an MFA at OCAD University at present, and who is also the author of a poetry collection, Disassociate, which is, I confess that it's been years now that I always mix the two, where I'm like, is it disassociate, disintegrate, or is it disintegrate, disassociate? It's disintegrate, disassociate, which is published at Arsenal Pulp Press, and Arielle is an award-winning poet who won the Dane Ogilvy Prize, amongst many other prizes, a couple of years ago. It's such a pleasure that we get to share this space today. And next, I will introduce Catherine Hernandez. Catherine Hernandez, also multidisciplinary force theater maker, multidisciplinary artist, painter also now, if you follow Catherine's paintings work on the social media. Catherine Hernandez is the author of the award-winning books Scarborough and also of Crosshair, which came out last year. Time is a bit distorted, which came out last year, which are, yes, two very special books that I very much love. I look forward to talking about them more. Next, Joshua Whitehead. Joshua Whitehead, who is, hello, right fresh off winning Canada Reads for Johnny Appleseed, if in case you did not know this. Also, Joshua just completed his PhD, so congratulations on this massive, massive achievement. And is also the writer of Full Metal Indigiqueer, a poetry collection, and Love After the End, which is an anthology of Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer speculative fiction. So welcome, Joshua. And our last but not least guest today is Lorimer Shenher. It's so nice that we get to share this space today. Lorimer Shenher is also an award-winning writer who wrote, amongst others, That Lonely Section of Hell, The Botched Investigation of a Serial Killer Who Almost Got Away, and This One Looks Like a Boy, My Gender Journey to Life as a Man. So thank you, everyone, for being here and for sharing this space today. As a reminder, so we'll be, just to give you the structure, we'll be in discussion with the panelists for the next 40 to 45 minutes. But in the meantime, if you have questions, you can always put your questions in the Q&A box. We probably will only get to them towards the end of the panel. But if during the talk you have questions, you can already put your questions in the Q&A box. So we'll get started. So my first question to you actually comes from, it's a very personal question actually, because each of you in different ways, and many more of you, all the other queer, trans, LGBTQ plus writers who are not in this little screen at the moment, I would say. So I consider myself like new-ish to Canada, in the sense of it's been about a decade that I've been here. And it's only been a few years, really. It's only been about, I would say, 5 to 6 years that I discovered CanLit and that I started reading Canadian literature. And what's interesting about it is that I fell in love with CanLit, and I started, even as a writer, seeing myself in CanLit when I discovered all of your work. And there's something that's very clear that happened, I would say, over the past 5 to 6 years in particular, within the Canadian literary context, where there's been an emergence of queer and trans voices, a lot of them being Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer and trans voices. And that's really how, for me, that I came to Canadian literature to start with. And I think it's always interesting, even in the moment now, when each time I look, let's say, at a short list of literary awards, like, I love that typically I'm just like, I guess queer and trans writers are writing good literature, because there's always somebody there on that list. So my question for you is, based on your own experience and your own understanding of quote unquote CanLit, like, what do you think, what for you changed over the past few years that allowed this emergence of queer and trans voices that we hadn't heard prior? Does somebody want to jump in?
I feel like I'm fairly new still. I just started writing in 2017. I think when I kind of just like popped up in CanLit, it was kind of out of nowhere. And I had some really good mentors at the time who really helped me find myself as a writer. And it was just like this moment where I was like, oh, like, trans women of color exist and can make art, and I don't have to just like hide in Halifax. And so I feel like I came in kind of like right as that shift was happening. Like, I was at the right place at the right time, with the right identity for like the politics that were kind of going on in 2017. And since then, I've just seen more and more, specifically like queer Indigenous artists come forward, and that has been really like special for me to be a part of.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Lorimer, please.
So I was only going to say, as someone who's been on the planet a long time, I, as a young trans person growing up in Alberta, the only thing that and I was a huge reader, but the only thing that was there for me to read was things about, very cis-normative, very heteronormative, very white, which, so on the face of it, everyone, in my family and life would have assumed that that was my jam, and it wasn't. And so I had that kind of weird reverse experience where everything I was reading was supposed to be for me, but none of it was. And it was a long time until I started to see things in CanLit that actually spoke to me. And it was always the outsiders and the oddballs and the misfits and those kinds of things, which I think at the time I tended to find more in American literature. And so sort of through university, I got an English degree. I tended to reading a lot of that fringe, with that sort of fringe material of fringe characters. And I was so grateful and happy to sort of see that zeitgeist that started to happen, that Arielle, you were lucky enough to be right on the wave of and God, it did not happen a minute too soon. Like it just was so necessary. And I'm so grateful to be able to read the fantastic things that your generation are writing. It's so refreshing and it's so great because, I don't want to say anything too sacrilegious against CanLit here, but it's really refreshing, really refreshing.
Thank you, Lorimer. Does Catherine or Joshua want to speak to that question?
Yeah, go ahead, Joshua. Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I guess like I would also call myself like a fairly new writer. Like my book of poetry didn't come out until 2017. And I think growing up in a small, impoverished on the res in a small town in Manitoba, like I grew up a hustler. I was in Austin and Talon Books had just published Jordan Abel. And I was like, okay, like I think I'm doing something interestingly in the same register, but like, hella queer or super queer. I'm about to swear on this, but it's not really a swear, I guess. But anyways, so I went up to Talon Books right there in Austin, Texas. I was like, hey, I have a pitch for you. Do you have 60 seconds? This is where everything's fitting in. And I think I was also just on the cusp of a transition, but a transition that was made from amazing, at least for my field and my arena, from amazing other queer Indigenous writers and non-binary and two-spirit Indigenous writers like Greg Schofield and Christos and Beth Brandt, Daniel Heath Justice, who have been doing this and paving this way for folks like myself to be there. And I also came up at a time almost like hand in hand with another Cree queer poet / writer, Billy Ray Belcourt, who I'm like, we are always like kind of misplaced for each other. Like we're doppelgangers, I think, for some folks in Canada. But so it was all kind of serendipitous at the same time. Not to say I haven't been writing prior, but I was like peddling poems for pennies. So I've come a long way in a short amount of time, but it is not without its blood, sweat, and tears. And for a long time prior to that, I just never saw myself in this kind of literary field that we call CanLit. I came across Thompson Highway one day and read Kiss of the Fur Queen, and that was it. I was like, this was kind of the ignition that I think I needed to see another kind of, queer Cree person in downtown Winnipeg, which is also my stomping grounds. But I also have a tumultuous relationship, I would say, with my idea of wrestling with, does Joshua Whitehead as the writer fit within the kind of borders of this thing we might call CanLit? And at times I say yes, because obviously I am hailed and recognized by such. But at first and foremost, I also don't define myself or try to conscript myself into fitting within the borders, the literary and the generic and the form of borders, but also the national borders that defy Indigenous sovereignty. So my ideology is, if I want to enact decolonial work within a land-based way and recognizing Indigenous nations as sovereign nations within this nation state we call Canada, I also must do so politically on the page and in how I kind of posit myself within the larger literary landscapes. So one, I am part of the machine of CanLit and the kind of the register in the field of it, but also I think I'm very much more embroiled within an Indigenous literary sovereignty, I suppose I would say. So I'm at the cusp. I rode the wave, and now I'm just deciding like where I want to posit the story so that the stories themselves are sovereign and two-spirited to the highest excellence I can put them within, and bring up those around me too.
I love that. I love that. And also I love the way that you put it, the peddling for pennies. Like, it sounds like the beginning of your biopic. Like, just imagine it. It's 2013 and Joshua Whitehead, the soon-to-be Canada Reads winner, was peddling for pennies. I would say that I think that when you think about the queer umbrella emerging into CanLit, I think a lot of it has to do with imminent disaster. Like, I think that because of the fact that we know that we are facing such great waves of change, so much of the structures that many of us hold dear slowly collapsing all around us, and rightfully so. That we're turning to people from the queer umbrella for not so much answers, but for the act of questioning, because I feel that being queer is not just about gender identity, it's not just about sexuality, it's about questioning. It's about saying, why do we do things this way? And can we do them better? At least that's how I've always thought of being queer, is that I think of it as a verb, like I'm queering things. Like, why does my family have to look like other families? Does my job have to look like other people's jobs? Can we do things differently? How can we share? How can we love differently? And so I think those are big questions that everyone is facing, especially, with the pandemic, is that we're having to question a lot how we're doing things, and can we do things differently? And I think that's why our voices are important. And I think that's why many of us on this call are part of this movement to stir shit up, is that we, because it has to be, we those things, those structures must topple, they must fall, they must burn to the ground. And I believe that we've been doing that for quite some time, and the way that we've been walking through this world is that we haven't taken a single step without questioning the reasons as to why we do them. And so I guess that kind of explains like our presence here. I'm hoping that makes sense, but it does to me. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for all those responses. Those are all like very just very generous responses in terms of getting us to understand this time, this sort of like socio-political cultural time in which we find ourselves as LGBTQ plus writers and artists. So thank you for that. Yeah, I maybe also just want to take a moment to also just kind of like give a bit of a shout out also to the indie presses, because my sense of it is, it's the indie presses, but not just the indie presses, but also the indie bookstores, right? Like there's a chain around, like there's a chain around like how a book gets made, and there are like all those factors between like the writer and then up until to the point where you pick up the book in a bookstore. And I think there's a lot that's been happening in terms of just having more indie presses by for queer people.
Yes.
In multiple ways as well. Like I think Arsenal Pub in particular as one of the publishing houses that really has been championing queer and trans voices for so long. And I think there's also, there's something just so meaningful about this. So what the questions, the next question that I have for you kind of like ties into this is, like correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of my experience of being here, and by here I mean on Turtle Island in Canada, and I know we've talked about this with I've talked about this with some of you. I know Catherine has been a theater practitioner for so long. It's like we also come as queer and trans people from that cabaret tradition, the spoken word tradition, the like the queer open mic traditions, where actually we've been telling our stories all this time for a very, very, very long time, right? Like, so there was always that part of storytelling. It's just that maybe it did not necessarily take the form of it being published in a book that then is sold in a bookstore. But like there's a tradition to how we tell stories as marginalized people, specifically as queer and trans people. Do you feel that, do we need to move? Like, is it, what is your take on there's this entire grassroots practice? Do we also need to have that grassroots practice enter the mainstream, the literary mainstream in that sense? Or how do you think about those two different fields?
I mean, like when it comes to, I love the fact that you're mentioning that, like the the cabaret world, and that that subversive world that has always been a safe space for LGBTQ2S folks to be able to express themselves. And there's like almost like this the sacredness of those spaces, right? There's an intimacy usually because it's not like as if you have like 300 people in those cabaret spaces. It's usually like max 100 in a space that is rented out in someone's like side room with one bathroom that only has one square of toilet paper left inside of it. I mean, we all know those spaces, right? Like those places where when was the last time they mopped? We don't know. But I'm going to do burlesque on it. It's just that it's those spaces I think will, for the safety of the people that will take up space in those, like they will, I think they will always remain subversive. And again, the reason being is for the safety of the people that are going to participate in those kinds of cabarets, because I know myself, coming out, those spaces were very important to me, and the intimacy was specific to those spaces. I don't know if it necessarily is a goal for queerness to be mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a beauty in the ways in which we share our stories that doesn't necessarily have to be on television or in a published book. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to see our presence there, but I still think that those other places are just as valid. It's not necessarily a goal. But as I mentioned, it's more like I think it's just more like how are those spaces quiet and private for parts of our community that aren't completely out yet. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Does somebody else want to speak to that question?
I'll go next. Yeah, I guess my tutelage was too, like sitting around my great-grand and my grand's dinner table, and all the aunties would be in there, and somehow my great-grand would like whip up 6 Bannock's in 20 minutes. I'm like, what just happened? And all the uncles are outside, they're all just talking about like who snaked who, which if you don't know what snaking means, just like who slept with who, the hookup stories, whose uncle's being annoying, blah, blah, blah. And they would just like one up. And I would just be like me, like the only kind of, I guess, male figure in the room as a boy listening to like these women just like kind of build on story. Like that was a major, I would say, writing and storytelling protocol and I guess pedagogy that I underwent. And then also just spending copious amounts of time in downtown Winnipeg on Osborne Avenue with the anarchists and like BIPOC rappers and sax musicians and collaborating with all these types of jazz musicians was kind of my like tutelage too, and like learning to like be like oratory and have a persona on a stage. And yeah, we'd all just, if you've ever been in downtown Winnipeg on Osborne, we'd all go to the Toad after, which is very much like what Catherine's saying. Like this really old house with carpets that have been there since like, I don't know when. Never been washed. Everything's a mess. But it was also like sanctuary too. And you're drinking like $3 Pilsner and playing a broken pool table and just sitting around telling stories and just talking about all the kind of fun we had as like artists all collaborating. And that to me was like also kind of so sacred of a space for me as a writer in training as well. And then in speaking about like, yeah, and then we would also like partake in activist events around the city and in my small town Selkirk, which is just outside of Winnipeg. And I think like combining those two, and now that I look back, I think like the idea of like grassroots or politics is already inherently bound to us as writers, so that we can't even forego or to pretend to defy the fact that our politics and our writing are like entwined as one, because our physical bodies are so tied to our bodies of text that they are and always will be. And we're always meant to be queer in the verb of the sense. And in that sense, it's like it allows for like radical transformation or just a kind of radical change. And yeah, that it's entirely everything. Joshua and Josh as a person and Joshua the writer are always political entities, because settler colonialism, heteropatriarchy, cisgendered folks have always said we are not supposed to be here, and we are. So every day and every story is a political defiance, I think.
Thank you, Joshua.
Yeah, to echo Josh, it's like growing up with like the oral traditions of Native women, felt like when I was growing up, I was like, I've heard this story 700 times. I don't need to hear it again. And now as an adult, I could like remember the stories because I've been told them so much. So that I think was like my first taste of like storytelling in any kind of way. And then I was just like a messy trans kid on the streets for a very long time and found community through being a messy trans kid. And I didn't think art was ever possible or was even something I wanted to do. And I think finding BIPOC community in Halifax, and I know Catherine and Kama, you are both very familiar with like how BIPOC community in Halifax is like so tight knit, and we have our secrets and we have our secret parties. And being introduced to that and being thrown into like BIPOcalypse, which was just like all these like brown bodies making art together, really like opened my eyes to like what possibilities I could create. And then that just kind of developed into this art practice of me writing a book really quickly. And now I'm in my master's and I found out I have a methodology that like 6 months ago, I was like, oh, methods. Yeah. Theory? Girl. Yeah, absolutely. So that feels cool. And I feel like it's like opened my mind to like even bigger possibilities. Which is funny. Academia is weird. But methods are cool and theories are cool. And that's cool.
Also, Arielle, can I just like plug too that you've also built a beautiful kind of virtual gaming community as well that I've partaken a little bit of, and y'all terrify me when we play Dead by Daylight. But it's an interesting virtual like sanctuary too. I just want to recognize that.
I was gonna wear my little like kitty cat headphones and be like a gamer girl while doing this panel, but I decided against it.
Oh my god, that would be so insulting. Could you imagine during this panel? It's like, I'm totally listening. I'm totally listening. This is really important. It's just, yeah.
Thank you, Arielle. Lorimer, I don't know if you want to add to this. Is there?
Only that the mainstream is just so. I think I feel quite a bit like Catherine does, insofar as the mainstream is just. I don't think it's something to really be aspiring to, for certainly for me, and this is some of the exploration I think I'm doing personally right now is just this idea of multiple identities that we all have, and then you all have that added identity of race, and being of color, that I don't share, but I feel such a kinship for, and I say that I don't want to obviously say, oh, I'm like you, I share that with you, I'm appropriating you guys or anything like that, but it's more like I feel more at home on this panel with these people than I do and have probably on any others. And it's because of that, I think. And it's because I'm just not that interested in the mainstream anymore. I don't find it interesting. I don't find it all that enlightening. And I don't find a lot of growth there for myself. And it's not to say there's anything wrong with it or anything else. It's just, I grew up with things that were called classics, and then you look back and you're like, really? Like, why was that a classic? And I, I don't steer my kids towards those books or films or whatever. It's more, it's like, well, who decided that was a classic? Like, that's my era where it was just everything was seen through that white gaze and that white lens, and I just like you, Catherine, I just want to blow that up. I really do. And I please don't send, ceases to my house or anything, but, it's just not interesting to me anymore. And so that sense of community that comes, I think, with queerness and with difference and marginalization is so powerful. And it's because it's a survival thing. It's and I say that as someone with so much privilege to have been able to hide for so long, even having some of these identities, or even just the one of being trans, but still with that huge amount of privilege to hide. And I guess it feels really disingenuous to me now to want to aspire to any of that, because I don't even see any value in it.
Yeah. I just thought had the most hilarious thought. Could you imagine, 50 years from now, people complaining like, ugh, it's like, can my teenage child stop reading Disintegrated to Dissociate? I mean, ugh, like, can we please read another book of poetry? Always, Arielle twist all the time. I just I would could you imagine? It's just me. That would be so much. We hopefully manifest that, but it would be very funny.
That would be so
We
cool.
were
Yeah.
It's like we just need a new voice. Enough of Arielle twist already. Yeah.
You'll be the Holden Caulfield of your generation. But, yeah.
It's so interesting that you mentioned this, Catherine, because as Lorimer was speaking, that was exactly what I was also thinking about. I was like, wait, in 50 years, will Johnny Appleseed be the classic? Right? I'm like, what is that? Yeah, but also, if I may say, of course, I think Joshua, you had mentioned this, just the massive success of Johnny Appleseed, as it should be, and it winning Canada Reads in Quebec in the Francophone literary context. We had one of the biggest books was actually from Kevin Lambert, La Querelle de Roberval, that came out within the Quebec a couple of years ago, but which also is it's a very working class novel, but with so much gay sex. And I'm like, I like the idea of an entire generation reading so much. But I'm like, what is that going to do in 25 years?
We shall see. Hopefully more bear scenes. I hope so.
Great. So reminder for those attending, if you want to ask a question, we're going to take questions in about 15 minutes. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll come back to them in a moment. And for now, I want to shift gears a little bit. We've talked about the institution, the structure, and how we fit within that and all of this. And now I want to turn a little bit more to your personal practice, your storytelling in terms of what you've been developing and what you want to be developing. It's also totally okay to say, no, I'm done for now. But I'm really interested in the question of urgency. And really this question comes from, because I remember, Catherine, you've said this multiple times, that Crosshair came about after the Pulse attacks, right? That this was the urgency where you're like, I need to write a book because this is what's happening. So I would be very curious to know what are the stories, what feels urgent to you as queer trans writers with multiple other intersecting identities, but in your storytelling right now, what are the stories you want to be putting out there that feel urgent?
Oh, and is this to me, Kama?
Sure, if you want to start.
Oh, okay, sure.
Maybe.
Did you mean to text me, Kama?
Spotlight.
I right now, it's I'm really thinking about how we tell stories and what stories get to be told over and over and over again. I'm I love and I hate the true crime genre. And because you watch it and there's always this roller coaster ride that you go on that always lands at the same place, which is basically the police done fucked us up. The patriarchy is pretending they were always on our side and that the victims are always going to be blamed, and that the victims are always told to just protect yourselves better. And then there's this belief that once that killer is taken away, then everything is solved. Done. We're all safe again. But then there are like thousands of these documentaries or fictional, scripted shows. And so right now, because it's connected to queerness, is that because I treated the pandemic like a writing residency. Let's just pretend I'm at a house, some nice little house, and I'm gonna just keep on writing. That's all I kept on doing like during the pandemic, is just like keep your head down and just keep on writing, keep on writing. So I wrote 2 novels, and the second of those novels is called Behind You, and it's basically about what it was like to be a young girl. I moved to Scarborough the same year that the Scarborough rapist was at large. And we all know who that is. We don't need to say his name. But just to show like what it was like to be a young closeted queer kid who was learning what it means to be a woman while women were being attacked. And like also the price you pay for being who you are, for the price you pay for being true to that song in your head. Because I always think about queerness being like there's a song in your head that you can't ignore, and so you just start humming along. Like that's what I think about when it comes to like my identity. It feels like there was a song in my heart and I didn't start singing along to it until I was much older. And so that's what the book is about. It's just about like what how does one fall into their identity when that identity could possibly mean you being attacked and killed by one of the most infamous killers in Canada in history. Yeah, so that's for me is like the most urgent thing that I'm dealing with right now. And then also thinking about like love, the possibilities of love, because the other novel that I was that I'm in the middle of writing for HarperCollins is about a Filipina personal support worker, so a PSW, and that's the name of the novel, PSW. She's cisgender, Filipina, grew up in a Catholic household like many Filipinas, but then develops this very deep and loving friendship with the white trans woman who is elderly that she is caring for when she moves to Canada and under the live-in caregiver program. And I really wanted to show the possibilities of what love can look like when we have those difficult conversations, when we can actually meet in the middle. Because I think I really wanted to show like a book where there's like examples of what you can, like how a relationship can actually grow through some really rough patches, but like ultimately we're all going towards the same thing, is that we all just want to be loved and acknowledged and cared for. And that's what the book is. So those are 2 very different things, like, but both of them to me are very urgent, is that the possibilities of love and the fact that we have to stop telling these stories over and over again of true crime. Yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. Does somebody else want to go next? What are the?
I'm gonna go next because
Sure,
I have to tell you about true crime because so my background was I was a police detective for about 27 years, and I've always hated true crime, and it's just never been interesting to me. And so when I wrote my first book, That Lonely Section of Hell, I think my publisher was really on the bubble between, is it a memoir? Is it true crime? And I mean, it was clearly to me a memoir, but we ended up on the cover and there's a quote, and I can't even, forgive me because I can't even remember who, but it says, like a horrifying read or something. And I was like, oh man, that is gonna terrify everyone who feels, like me, who's not interested in true crime. And it just, I don't know, it's interesting because I kind of have that love-hate relationship with it. I don't read true crime, I never have. And so it's, but but what I think has sort of come out of that whole experience for me, and this idea of urgency in writing, is more that I am becoming more and more struck by universality of experience in terms of trauma, really, and all of us coming from, I think, in many respects, shared experiences of trauma. And it, you know, the pandemic kind of heightened that for me. It sort of made me think, like, we're all going through this giant collective trauma, and it's not ending. It's going on and on and on, and that's what led me into my current writing, which is another. It's I guess a biography in a way of. Thankfully not me this time, because I've written 2 memoirs about myself and I'm pretty done with writing about myself. But it's about a really good friend of mine who I met in my PTSD residential treatment program. And he was a child soldier in the Iran-Iraq war and just had a phenomenal, incredible life story that, you know, the kind of story you could never, you couldn't make up. And so that's what I've been working on, is that story, and it just crosses all lines and all experiences in terms of what happens to all of us as people, as these really fragile, delicate souls, and when we're all hurt in different ways, and how we, you know, how that happens to us, how we respond to that, or, you know, how we survive or don't survive. And that feels urgent to me, because I just feel like everything happening right now, not just COVID, but, you know, everything happening politically right now feels like a giant trauma to me. And that fear that you speak about, and, you know, that fear of just being yourself and being yourself in the world. You know, we all know, all of us sitting here, we all know what that's like, to feel like, what, you know, you're going to walk out of your house and possibly be attacked for who you are. And that wears on us as people so much that it bends and changes who we are.
I guess I'll build on that too. Speaking of true crimes, I think like the urgency of my writing very much comes out of, I'm sure Arielle would agree, of like the complete dead, like genocide, cultural and actual, of Indigenous peoples. I couldn't find a better shirt to wear today besides the Orange 215 and now the 1505. So I'm working on a book right now, which is coming on the spring, Making Love with the Land, and it's about indigeneity, primarily queerness, queerness and mental health primarily. And to be working on that through COVID was wondrous, but also horrific bloodletting, I would say, of putting myself on the stage as like nonfiction. And it came out of an experience I had. I used to work for the Friendship Centers, which is a national organization which helps and has kind of all these cultural activities for primarily, a lot of times, like primarily inner city Indigenous folks, but also BIPOC folks at large too, and those are impoverished. And so I worked for the Selkirk Friendship Center in my small little hometown in Manitoba. And I ran in the summer this day camp, which was like the funnest. I was like paid to go like tubing and taking these kids for the first time to see like the zoo, and letting them do things like the very first time going go-karting. It was all subsidized, so it was very little cost to the families. It was like one of the most fun experiences I've ever had in my life. I ran that for 5 years. And then outside of the summers, I would run this youth drop-in. So we did cultural revitalization, language revitalization, but then also things like learning how to cook, and then just kind of hanging out and watching movies. And so if anyone knows Manitoba, it gets very, very hot and humid. Like plus 40 to 45 is like a pretty much a norm. I'm sure folks in Toronto and Ontario also know. I can't really speak much to the East Coast or the West Coast. I've never spent a lot of time there. But so it's this middle of summer. It was like the height of July, I guess I would say. And we had this 14-year-old boy come in, and we thought it was a heat stroke. And it turns out he had overdosed on opiates on our desk. And so we had the ambulance come in, and he's fine. He came in maybe like 2 weeks later, and we had asked like, what happened? And he thought this idea of like, I just thought like an overdose or touching death or jumping through the hoop of a near-death experience was just like a natural part of growing up, and like that never ever left me. So I'm like asking myself, like, what type of like extreme and injurious pain does a 14-year-old boy have to be in to be addicted to painkillers? Like, what is that pain? And obviously it's systemic, and obviously it's intergenerational. But that to me was like a huge primer in thinking about the urgency of what I wanted to do. And then having like these kind of taboo or secret conversations with so many Indigenous folks in my life, primarily queer and two-spirit folks, like in the secrets, like, hey, I just want to let you know, I'm feeling very depressed today, or had suicidal ideation, or I have anxiety or insomnia, or all of these like large topics that become so taboo and scary and are seen as disempowering, I think, for a lot of Indigenous folks, primarily queer, trans, or two-spirit Indigenous folks. So I thought, well, the best thing I can do, like with the kind of social capital I have as a writer now, was just like remove the mask of character and allow myself to also talk about my own, some of them not so, I would say, intense, but some of them intense, like sexual assault and eating disorders. Talk about that as for me, because I felt like if I was able to like show that these are topics can be talked about with myself, with the communities, and then larger on in the scope of a book, I would hope, and that's my goal, is that is also an allowance to have these conversations as well for folks who may be reading it, primarily Indigenous youth who are like committing suicide at some of the highest rates in Canada. And a lot of those youth are, you know, Indigenous, trans, non-binary, queer, two-spirit folks who just don't have the agency or the kind of space to have these conversations around their identity, around their mental health, and how those two braid in a space that sometimes dislodges you from it, like the reservation, which could be, I think it's getting better, at least mine is, but when I was a kid, like you could not be queer and Indigenous on the res, and you also couldn't be queer and Indigenous in the urban spaces. So it was, you had to obliterate one to become the other. Now I have found a way to like bring them together, and I think a lot of youth are doing that, but not quick enough. So my urgency very much comes for the sake of like having the generations before me also emerge into this field that I'm in and take it so much further. And right now I'm just doing that through the lens of queerness and mental health from Indigenous perspectives, and sometimes having to risk my own body and put it on the line. But I think that's a role I take as a storyteller, is that I also have to risk take in order to kind of gain space too. So.
Thank you. Arielle, do you want to add to this?
Yeah, I feel like Canlit chewed me up and then spit me out really young. I was very young when I like started this journey, and I wanted to take a really long break after touring my book and just kind of like being this little fire that I was at like 22 years old. And the pandemic, I remember Catherine asked me a question when me and Josh were doing something for the Koffler Center a couple years ago about hope and if I still felt it. And I was like, I don't feel it. And I think this pandemic has like really pushed me into like reimagining hope. And I've been working on trying to write stories about trans elders because that's kind of like what I want. I want hope to live, to be a trans elder. I want to be an Indigenous trans elder with all my Indigenous trans friends and like say that we survived like the gluttony of this industry. And so that has been what felt the most urgent to me during this time. Reading work by trans women in my master's has been really like fueled this fire to like just live. Like I just want to live, and in living I will continue to write at some point. But right now I'm just like trying to get back that hope.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Arielle. Thank you everyone for actually responding to this question with just so much honesty and heart and generosity. This really like nurtures me in, I'm not going to speak for the audience, but I'm going to speak for myself. Like, thank you so much for holding this space and your narratives and where you're coming from and doing it so generously and with so much honesty. Time's going by fast. We have 10 minutes. So I will quickly
Lightning round.
I will go through ask some of the questions from the audience. We might not be able to get through all of them. If there are more questions from the audience, right now is the time, put it in the Q&A. We'll try to get to them. So one of the questions, and maybe we'll do those a bit faster or shorter. One of the questions that we have is around the question from Emily W, which is around the question of success, which specifically was a response to what Lorimer said earlier around wanting to be part of them, not wanting to be part of the mainstream, rather. So I'm wondering if I quote, I'm wondering if mainstream measurements of success are not aspirational. What does success look like for you? Is it more to do with community engagement and less to do with acclaim or prizes, or is it a very personal sense of your own accomplishment? Is that, the question was framed at Lorimer, but also open for anyone. Is that something somebody wants to respond to in terms of, for you as a writer, what is your own standard and understanding of success?
Well, I'll start. I'll be quick. None of those things for me, really. It was just that burning need to tell, especially my first book. It was a story that I felt like had to be in. It was in the public interest. I felt like it was in danger of never seeing the light of day. The enormity of our failure as police officers to do the right things, and it was just, and just the tragedy of missing and murdered Indigenous women and all the women that were killed. I just, it was like a hot coal inside my chest that I just had to get out of there. So I don't know if that, I had no real illusions of success, whatever that means, and or accolades or any of those things. It just wasn't none of that was or really is on my radar. It was just a matter of this is, way before I was a police officer, I was a reporter, and I should have stayed there. And that's always really been my orientation, I think, as a writer, is from a sort of a truth telling perspective. And so that's success for me, is to try to either identify injustices, right them if that's at all possible. Usually isn't, but to identify injustice and speak to it, and speak truth to power, I think.
I think I felt successful as soon as I signed a book deal. I was like, this is a big deal. I'm like a messy kid, and someone wants to read my poetry. And then when I was touring my book, being able to talk to like trans Indigenous kids, and like realize that I have like built this community of like trans native girls all across the country that I got to meet while touring. That feels like the biggest success. That feels like sharing things. Like, the awards were cool. I was like, yeah, that's really exciting, because I think that opens me up to a broader audience and like makes it more accessible for other Native people in America. Was like the big thing. Trans women in America reaching out to me was a big thing. But just like building community that I didn't know could exist was like, that's success.
Yeah. Well, I guess I would say, like, I felt successful like with my first book, Full Metal. And one of the poems in Full Metal, Bikugani, which means rose in Cree, won a Governor General's History Award, I think in like 2016. And that was kind of like the big progenitor or push to like have a book deal. But the poem itself is about my grandmother who was murdered in the 60s, and it kind of placed my whole family through like the 60s, or at least my paternal side of the family through the 60s scoop. And I try to do like this, what I call this kind of like yearly morning pilgrimage to go to Saskatoon where she's buried in this unmarked grave, and I have to use this app to find her. And no one ever wants to help me find her exact spot in this large graveyard, the cemetery. And so like when that poem was published and put into that book, and the book received the accolades and people are studying it in universities, I felt like that to me was success, in that I got to, like, we may not be able to afford the graveyard, or sorry, the grave site or the grave marker, but that was so much more than, you know, sticks and cobble. So yeah, that to me was like my big success. And this was prior to like anything really. Was just that her name was on a page, that page was being written, and people weren't going to forget, because I also named her murderer in that poem too. So that to me was success, and a little bit of the showing me like the power of stories too. So.
There are always these beautiful messages that people send you saying that they feel seen by your work. I'm sure that all of you have experienced this. It's so generous of people. They don't have to do that, but they do. And so I'm thankful for that. But the thing that feels like a real success for me is that if you think about it, so before I became a published author, I remember begging my daughter, who's very, very smart, saying, "Don't you want to get into HVAC?" Because I thought, well, then your school will be paid for, and you're going to make a lot of money an hour if you get into HVAC. I mean, like, she's like a bright kid, right? But I was just like, I don't have money for your university, okay? I don't know where this money is going to come from. From that to going to, you know, with the gigs that I'm getting now, writing also for television, is that now it looks like most of her undergrad would be paid for. And to think about that, like, just, it really, like, it makes me feel like really, like, almost moved to tears, because I really thought, like, man, kid, you are so smart and you are going to be so in debt because I have nothing to give you. And at least with this, she will be a little bit more at ease when she graduates. Just makes me really happy. I'm very proud of that all of this. And I remember because we just saw the screener for the film Scarborough, and my daughter said, "Wow, Mom, this came from your mind." And that's exactly what it feels like. It feels like you're like, oh my gosh, this is real. I mean, I'm sure all of us feel that way. It's like sometimes you're like looking at like these books like, wait, I wrote this, what? And then people are going to read it. Oh, it's just so weird that people would want to spend money on things that came from your mind. I just feel so thankful. This is such a great life. I'm really thankful, and I'm thankful to all of you out there who read our books. Holy moly cannoli. I'm just thankful for all of you. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Okay, I'm gonna ask one last question. I'm gonna ask the question first. I'm gonna make a couple of comments so you can think through what is it, how you want to answer that question, just for the interest of time. Somebody asked, inspired from what Catherine said earlier around the song "Queerness as a Song That Plays in Your Head." Somebody asked, what is the song that is playing in your head at the moment? So I think that's a good end question, because we're like just about time. So think about it. What is the song that's playing in your head at the moment? But in the meantime, I wanted to ask everybody and invite everybody to support all those artists who are with us today: Catherine, Arielle, Joshua, Lorimer, to buy their books, to ask your bookstores and your libraries to order their books, but also check out the other titles. From most of them are published from indie publishers. Check out those other titles. Check out who are the other queer, trans, racialized, indigenous artists out there, and make sure you listen to those stories, you soak them in, you learn from them, you grow from them, and support them. So maybe as a way to wrap up, should we do a go around, or like, what is the song that's playing in your head at the moment?
Oh, it's always Stevie Wonder. You know that you can feel it all over. You can feel it all over, people. That one always in my head. That's as gay as you can get, inside my head, on repeat.
Thank you, Catherine.
I won't sing mine. But Catherine, when we come to Toronto, we're going to do karaoke, okay?
Filipino to the max.
Like, I'm in. I think my queer song, and like the song that's always stuck in my head, especially when I write, is anything by Brandy Carlisle. And I would say the queer anthem to my life is "The Joke" by Brandy Carlisle. So that's
Ah.
The song that's playing in my head right now isn't even like a queer song. It's just like Olivia Rodrigo's whole album is so angsty and just so good. And I just like, she's just like stuck in my head. And I'm just like, I remember being 17, and it was long ago now. And I want that fire back.
I'm gonna sweat just thinking about 17. Yeah. That's awesome.
Mine is, well, it's going to be funny to you guys, but it's Boogie with a Hoodie, Fall in Love. It's because I drive my kids everywhere. They're all teenagers, and so they've their music is my music nowadays. And yeah, I'm kind of into Boogie with a Hoodie. I don't know, it's good stuff. So I can't sing it. It's hard for me, and you know, some of the beats are really different than what I'm familiar with. So my karaoke might be a little off on that one, but it's.
Hey, you have to really train for it before you get to my house, okay, Lorimer?
Yeah, I will.
It's a Filipino house. I expect Filipino level karaoke when you.
Oh man, okay, that's hardcore. Okay, I'll bring it. I'll be ready.
Couple outfit changes.
Yeah, I got it all going on.
It's
yeah,
all very necessary.
All right, I'm there.
Oh, Kaba, what's yours? If we could ask.
Yeah.
Oh yes,
sure.
yes.
I mean, it's probably your Whitney Houston. Really, it's the gayest thing. I'm every woman, you know. I'm all the women. It's the gayest thing that's always playing in my head.
Nice.
By the way, I love the homage to Whitney Houston in Catherine's novel. So I'm like,
Oh
yes,
yeah,
I think it's the gay song. The full discography is on repeat.
I mean, she never came out in real life, but she gets to come out through all of us if we keep on singing her songs. So there you go.
Yeah. You know, I love that actually Vivek Shreya dedicates the subtweet to Whitney Houston. You know, I'm like, you dedicated the entire novel to Whitney Houston. Like, oh my heart.
All of it.
Well, thank you everyone. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for the audience for joining in, but also thank you every single one of you, Catherine, Arielle, Joshua, Lorimer, for just being so generous with this conversation today. I'm assuming Daphna is coming back for the concluding remarks.
Yes, I am. And what a note to end on. I love everybody laughing and telling me about their songs. So thank you so much, Kama and Catherine and Arielle and Josh and Lorimer, for lending us your time, your thoughts, your talent tonight. It was just wonderful. And for anyone out there who missed tonight's event or know of somebody who missed tonight's event, this video will be available on our YouTube channel during the next couple of days. And please don't hesitate to join us again on August 9th for our final monthly master panel. We will talk to some of Canada's best polyglots and investigate the art of translation at that time. So thank you so much for joining us. Be well.